The house didn't look like a crime scene. That was the first thing that struck people when they walked in. Everything was in order. The kitchen was clean. The living room was undisturbed. If you didn't know something was wrong, you probably wouldn't have felt it. Except maybe one thing: a lampshade sitting slightly off in the living room, small enough to ignore, easy to walk past. They kept going, and then they reached the garage. Russell Dur was on the floor between two parked cars. 88 years old, retired, a Navy veteran, 9 grandchildren. He'd been decapitated. His body was in a robap. Towels had been placed around him in a careful ring, not thrown, not scattered, arranged, like someone had thought about it. The blood had barely spread beyond where he was lying. What unsettled investigators wasn't just the violence, it was how composed the scene felt afterwards. Someone had moved a lamp from inside the house into the garage and left it on. They couldn't find the light switch. Investigators later said even they had trouble locating it. So they brought their own light source and just worked by that. They took their time, they cleaned up, and then they left. The people who found Russell weren't police. They were friends who'd driven out that Tuesday morning because Russell and Shirley had missed a Kentucky Derby gathering the weekend before. No call to explain why, no answer when people tried reaching them. That alone felt wrong. These weren't people who went quiet. So their friends came to check. They called their names at the door. Nothing. The kitchen door was unlocked, so they went in, moved through the house, and found nothing unusual until they didn't. When investigators arrived and started piecing the scene together, one detail kept coming back to them. Shirley wasn't there. Both cars were in the driveway. Her purse was inside the house, her phone, her keys, everything she would have needed to go anywhere. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign of forced entry, nothing taken from the home, despite there being obvious valuables left out in the open. Russell was dead. Shirley was gone, and the house looked like someone had simply paused it mid-afternoon and walked away. Russell and Shirley Dur had been together most of their lives. They met in college, married in 1950, and raised 4 children together. Russell spent decades building a business before retiring in 1994. That same year, they bought a quiet lakefront home in Putnam County, Georgia. It was where they planned to spend the rest of their lives quietly. In 2014, they were both nearing 90. People who knew them described them as stable, ordinary, predictable. No enemies anyone could think of, no financial trouble, nothing that made them seem like targets. Measured investigative tone. The community they lived in was gated, private road, private dock out back opening directly onto the lake. The security camera at the front entrance had been knocked out by a storm a few weeks earlier. No one had realized it stopped recording, so there was no footage, no log of who came in or when. A neighbor later reported seeing someone walking in the Durs yard around the time investigators believed the crime took place. But the trees between the properties were too thick. No face, no useful description. Along the concrete path leading down to the dock, someone noticed a fresh scrape on the ground, the kind left by something being dragged. Shirley had been missing for 10 days at this point. No ransom demand, no contact, no sign of her anywhere. And the silence itself had started to say something.
On the 10th day, a fisherman called it in. He was out on the water about 6 miles from the Dur home when he saw something near the surface. He wasn't sure at first, but he made the call anyway. When patrol boats reached the area, they found her. Shirley Dur was suspended just below the surface, caught in the tops of submerged trees that had been underwater since the lake was first created. She was still fully dressed. Her legs had been tied with parachute cord to 2 concrete blocks, each weighing roughly 30 pounds. Someone had put real thought into making sure she stayed down there. The water was 46 feet deep at that spot. Under most circumstances, she never would have surfaced. Passing changed that. The sheriff later said he personally pulled her from the water. The autopsy was straightforward. Multiple blunt force injuries to the head, consistent with a hammer or something similar. She was already dead before she entered the lake. The medical examiner was clear on that. What investigators couldn't determine was where she'd been killed. The sheriff later noted that the kind of trauma Shirley suffered would have produced a devastating scene. Extensive blood, significant forensic evidence. Investigators had already processed the Dur home carefully. There was nothing, not a trace of what happened to her inside that house. She was killed somewhere else, somewhere that still hasn't been identified. Russell's autopsy had already raised a separate problem. His torso showed no obvious fatal wounds. Whatever killed him had been removed along with his head. The official cause of death was listed as an unknown head wound, which told investigators almost nothing about what actually happened in that garage. Then the lab found gunshot residue on Russell's shirt collar. Russell was known to shoot squirrels around the property, so the residue alone didn't prove anything. But it raised a possibility investigators couldn't dismiss. If Russell had been shot in the head, the bullet and everything it could have revealed about the weapon and the person who fired it would still be inside the skull. Taking the head wasn't just violence, it was a decision. Russell's head has never been found. Investigators spent months working through everyone connected to the Durs. Family members cooperated fully. They voluntarily took polygraph tests, sat through interviews, and handed over whatever investigators requested. All of them came back clean. There was no financial dispute, no inheritance conflict, nothing in the family history pointing anywhere useful. Yard workers and maintenance staff connected to the gated community were polygraphed. A former employee of Russell's was interviewed. Nothing developed. Investigators even revisited the death of the Durs' eldest son, Mark, who'd been shot and killed in Atlanta in 2000 during a drug deal. But the man responsible was still in prison. There was no evidence connecting that case to this one. Every thread they pulled went nowhere. Theories started forming outside the investigation as well. Some people looked at the controlled nature of the scene, the cleanup, the decapitation, the deliberate disposal of Shirley's body, and concluded this had to be professional, someone hired to do it. The sheriff didn't believe that. His reasoning was simple. A professional killer shoots you and leaves.
They don't spend hours managing a crime scene. They don't transport a body miles across a lake, and they don't take unnecessary risks. The effort involved in hiding Shirley, the cord, the concrete blocks, the distance from the house, felt less like professional precision and more like someone improvising under pressure. The sheriff's working theory was that whoever entered the house believed Russell and Shirley had something valuable hidden there, and when they couldn't find it, the situation escalated into something they hadn't fully planned for. It explained the cleanup, but it didn't explain the motive, which left investigators in an uncomfortable position. A double homicide with no clear reason behind it, and no one to point to. The FBI eventually became involved. A behavioral analysis unit developed a perpetrator profile. A $20,000 reward was offered for information. More than 100 billboards went up across Georgia, 50 of them in Atlanta alone. Weeks passed, then months, then years. The case stayed open. Leads came in, were checked, and dissolved. People were re-interviewed. The file never closed, but it also never moved. Then, in 2023, almost a decade after Russell and Shirley were killed, investigators sent evidence to a specialized laboratory in Texas, a facility that works specifically with degraded DNA. Material standard testing no longer reads clearly. The sheriff personally drove the evidence there himself. The lab found a foreign DNA profile on Russell's clothing, genetic material that didn't belong to Russell, didn't belong to Shirley. Someone had been close enough to leave a trace. The sheriff later described it as the strongest evidence the case had produced in nearly 10 years. As of early 2025, investigators were still waiting on the full results, and if the profile doesn't match anyone already inside criminal databases, the next step would likely be genealogical testing, the same method that's quietly solved cold cases that sat untouched for decades.
It's still possible this gets solved, but here's what stays with people about this case. Russell Dur served in the United States Navy during World War II. He came home, built a life, raised a family, and spent the next 60 years doing exactly what most people hope to do, growing old beside someone he loved. Shirley spent most of her life taking care of the people around her. By every account from people who knew her, that was simply who she was. They were both in their late 80s. They had been married for over 60 years, and they were living quietly in a lake house in Georgia, where by any reasonable expectation, nothing like this was ever supposed to happen. But yet, someone entered that house, killed them both, and has now spent more than a decade living freely afterward. The violence itself is disturbing, but what lingers isn't the violence. It's the fact that a man who survived a world war couldn't survive a weekend inside his own home. It's that Shirley, tied to concrete blocks, lowered into 46 feet of water, was meant to disappear completely, meant to never be found, meant to become one of those cases where the second victim simply vanishes from the record because there was never a body recovered. But she surfaced anyway. The case is still open. Russell's head is still missing, and whoever did this is still out there.